Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished law professor at Rutgers Law School, author of The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, and director of the Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR. You can learn more about the center by visiting our website at csrr.rutgers.edu or following us on Instagram at RutgersCSRR or on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. The Race and Rights Podcast explores the myriad issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, here as well as abroad. Today's podcast is entitled Merge Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections, and Saving America, featuring Berkeley law professor Haney Lopez, who will discuss his book by the same name. Professor Lopez explains how the political manipulation of coded racism, also known as dog whistle politics, has evolved in the aftermath of the Trump presidency. Professor Lopez discusses how merging the struggles for racial justice and for shared economic prosperity builds solidarity across racial lines that is necessary for winning elections. Let's hear what our guest has to say about how to respond to the growing political polarization across America.
So there's a way that I come into scholarship by trying to understand the world around me and my place in it. So white father, Salvadoran mother, actually I should say, grew up in Hawaii. So as a mixed race kid in Hawaii, tons of them, not a big deal. And though I was spending a couple of summers in El Salvador and spoke Spanish and felt more affinity for my mother's family in El Salvador than for my dad's in Eastern Washington, I would not describe myself as a Latino growing up because Latino didn't exist as an identity in Hawaii. There were a range of racial identities. Latinx wasn't one of them. When I came to school on the mainland, basically I was a scholarship kid, so I went wherever I had the best scholarship, and that was St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis in those years, I'm sure still today, indeed, Ferguson is like this adjoining suburb of St. Louis. It is a white-black world, and it is a white over black world. There and then on the East Coast in graduate school, that's where I really came to develop a Latinx identity, in the process of which I came to understand what was happening to me. And that was, as someone who was educated and articulate, mixed race, but at that point with the name Ian Haney, I was an enigma initially, and then people were resolving the enigma by saying, oh, you're white. I was being granted an honorary white identity. This sort of, because you're educated, because you're here in this competitive environment, because you're performing well, we'll presume that you're white. And this was very jarring. It was a couple of instances. One in which one of my close friends asked me why I was going to a student of color meeting. And I'm like, because I'm a student of color. And she's like, no, you're not. And I'm like, but you're one of my close friends and you don't know that. And then another episode, it was essentially the same thing, but a very different form. I was stopped by the police for walking in a white neighborhood, which surrounds the university. And the police were very hostile until I showed them a state driver's license from Hawaii. And then Hawaii was what would explain my brownness. And then it went from very hostile encounter to, oh my God, I love it. Well, I went there for my honeymoon, blah, blah, blah. I came to understand the dynamic was some initial questions about who I was and how I fit being resolved through a presumption of whiteness, through this sort of as etiquette. I'm going to be extended this honorary whiteness. So I changed my last name. And in graduate school, I started using my mother's surname. And that's when I started going by Haney Lopez. The first time I submitted a paper under Haney Lopez, and remember, I was, as a student, I submit a paper under the name Haney Lopez, and it comes back to me ungraded with the comment, is English your first language? And so I was like, oh, snap, this is going to be easy. I'm going to go from white to non-white in a heartbeat. And I did. And I became non-white in two very remarkable ways. One, I was almost immediately seen as unintelligible, like unintelligible and unintellectual, right? Like any presumption of intellectual competence was erased once I started using Lopez. And two, my reaction to social injustice was shifted from a considered critique of society, which is what whites are allowed to do, to unreasonable anger which is how people of color are understood. When we say, hey, the structure of society, this is unfair, this is unjust, this dehumanizes people, this brutalizes people. I had more liberty to say that as Haney than I had to say that as Haney Lopez, because once I started to say that as Haney Lopez, I was understood as unintellectual, and therefore in my response to what I'm seeing around me as angry. And so this then shapes how I begin to think about race and law and power. The first couple of books are about really engaging the way in which the Latinx community is constructed in relationship to the state through law and through legal violence. And it takes this historical moment when the Mexican American community in LA fights for adequate education. And the fight for adequate education, and just to be clear, there could be nothing more assimilationist than asking for decent schools, right? There's nothing radical about decent schools. Decent schools is, we want to participate in your society. There's no better way to express the sentiment of we want to participate in the society than to say we want a decent education. To which the police responded by arresting the student leaders who organized these different strikes and demonstrations, charging them with disrupting the peace. That was easy. Charging them with felony conspiracy to disrupt the peace because they had conspired to organize this walkout. And the student organizers who were trying to get decent schools faced 44 years in jail. That was the state's response. And then it radicalized these students who then went from, we want an education because we want to participate, to we want to tear the society down. This becomes what I'm writing about. And in a sense, I'm brought there through my own biography, through this sort of, frankly, radicalizing experience of seeing, I've seen both sides of the color line. I have been granted an honorary presumption of whiteness, and I've seen that I am understood in a dramatically different way if I simply say, call me Lopez. Completely different, right? And so that process then led me to think about race and power and law. I say that, I make the connection between my biography and my scholarship because I want to suggest that for all of you, you're in law school. You will not have again the same freedom and support to think through the biggest questions in your life. You start working, and your ability to read and to think critically and to debate, it will narrow. So don't divorce what you're learning at Rutgers from what you're wrestling with yourself at the deepest level, because you wrestling with the big questions that you have, that is a route forward for you to engage the larger social and political questions of our times. And it could be race, it could be gender, it could be class, it could be something that doesn't have anything to do with identity. You could be like, I just don't understand why we're doing what we're doing to the environment. I mean, I don't really care but what is it that disturbs you, that bothers you, that strikes you as singularly unfair, that you feel like this needs to change? That's what you need to understand, because you can't change anything you don't understand. And whatever it is, seize this moment to be like, this is what I want to dive into.
Then came dog whistle politics, right? You became a phenom. Scandal, 3 episodes of Scandal devoted to the concept of dog whistle politics. It's part of our political vocabulary. I think one of the initial questions, I want you to talk about the whole concept of dog whistle politics and talk a little bit about the book. But did you coin the term or did you pick up the term?
I coined it. So dog whistle politics is this idea. It's a metaphor that says, look, political speech is operating at 2 levels. Like, there's a literal dog whistle. There's a dog whistle out there. The term itself is actually from Australia, where I guess they have lots of dogs and dog whistles, and you need to train dogs. So a dog whistle blows at such a high frequency that human ears can't hear it, but dogs can. They use it as a training tool where they'll, blow a whistle. Humans don't hear it, but dogs hear it, and dogs are then respond to the whistle. That's what a literal dog whistle is. As a metaphor for political speech, it suggests language that's operating on one level that's superficially not about race, but that on another is actually designed to trigger racist thinking. So illegal alien, thug, gangbangers, welfare queen, if youth terrorist, Muslim terrorist, actually, because you can pretend that that's not about race by adding religion. If you think about those terms, on their surface, there's no direct reference to race. But underneath are these deep racist stories about people of color as inherently violent and criminal or inherently undeserving and lazy. Notice every story about people of color is simultaneously a story about whites. We don't exist as races in nature. We exist as races in terms of social positioning. And the positioning of people of color as inferior only makes sense as counterposed to the positioning of whites as supposed superiors. So there's a set of dog whistles for whites. It triggers racist thinking, not in the sense of denigrating whites, but in the sense of elevating them. So patriot, middle class, silent majority, the real Americans, the American heartland, make America great again. These are dog whistles too. They trigger thinking about whites animated by a stereotype of superiority. The dog whistle concept is an argument that says this is the language in which racial hierarchy in America has been debated for the last 50 years. But because it's been framed in this coded language, most people deny that that's the actual conversation we're having.
Great. I was looking through some reviews, and there was an article that you wrote about Paul Ryan. And I think there's some pushback, from the conservative community about, well, then how do we talk about crime? How do we talk about public assistance? How do we talk about these issues if every time we raise these issues, we're going to be accused of being racism? And so right now, I feel like we're a little bit in a hall of mirrors where when you raise issues of racism, even when you're not talking about racism, the conversation becomes, you're accusing us of racism. You're playing the race card. The race card itself is probably a dog whistle.
Exactly. Let's do a little bit of history, and then we'll come back to this question. The question of the position of whites and people of color in America has always been central to American politics. If you think about the founding of the country was founded through a process of debate and compromise between the 13 colonies over where slavery would be allowed to exist and under what terms and when it might be expected to end. That was the founding debate that almost prohibited the colonies from coming together into one country. And if when you take constitutional law, you can see the way in which that debate then structures the form of the Constitution. Or you can think about westward expansion, reservation policy, genocide against Native Americans, huge debates. Or you can think about the U.S.-Mexican War, big debate about whether the United States should expand. What is the fate of these new peoples who are considered racial inferiors? California, expansion into empires, Rose has written about, right? All of these are huge, enormous racial debates that we've been having in the United States forever as part of our politics. With the civil rights movement, you get this cultural shift where the civil rights movement successfully shows that open endorsements of white superiority reflect deeply immoral ideas. And we start to use the phrase racist. Racist means morally wrong, right? It's morally wrong now. And this is novel in America. It is novel to say, oh my gosh, there's something morally wrong with asserting that whites are superior. That is one of the accomplishments of the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s. What happens to these open conversations about the superiority of whites vis-a-vis people of color that have been a staple part of American political conversation then for 150 years? Do they end? No. They go underground. It's not that the conversation about the superior position of whites goes away in American politics. It simply shifts. It becomes subliminal. It's now conducted in terms of dog whistles. So if you think about Make America Great Again, Make America Great Again is a conversation that we've been having in the United States about whether this country is for whites or people of color. We've been having this debate for 200 years. It's just that now we have it in code. That is the shift. Okay. In that context, the move to code is a giant charade. It's a giant con. It's 50 years of gaslighting, right? Because for 50 years, the Republican Party has been saying, this is a white man's country. In fact, there's a great quote. In 1963, Republican National Convention in Denver, there was a conservative reporter. He goes to their convention. That's when they decide that they're going to start talking about race in codes, states' rights, forced busing, all of that. They're going to start using those codes as a way to win white votes. And the reporter comes out and he writes this article and it says, Republican Party leadership has decided to become the white man's party, in fact, though not in name. And that in fact, though not in name, is they're going to use code. They made this decision in 1963. To be clear, as a matter of strategy, not bigotry, this is going to be strategy. But in effect, well, here's a different way to think about it. In 1963, this faction of the Republican Party that made that decision was allied with Barry Goldwater. Who was Barry Goldwater? Barry Goldwater hated the New Deal. Barry Goldwater was the scion of a wealthy family from Arizona who well and truly believed that government should do nothing for regular people. And that really worked well if you're from a wealthy family because A, you don't need government to do anything for you, and B, if government does nothing for regular people, government can slash taxes on the very rich. So Barry Goldwater has this vision in which he says, hey, we're going to end the New Deal. We're going to end the Great Society. We're going to make sure government does nothing for working people, but instead protects the interests of the rich. And then Barry Goldwater says to himself, but I notice when I say that, I get no support. So I wonder how I can get support. What if I say to people, not, I plan to run government on behalf of the rich, but I plan to run government on behalf of whites? But it's 1963. I can't say that outright. What if I say instead, I plan to run government on behalf of states' rights? And states' rights, that's an abstraction, right? I mean, if you take in con law, you know that it's very hard to get super interested in state-federal relations. But you can run a campaign on it if people understand states' rights as the rights of southern states to continue to oppress and humiliate African Americans and to elevate whites. And that's what he did. So if it starts there, it starts as a massive lie. And what is the lie? The lie is that our political parties are primarily interested in defending a racial group, whites. What is the reality? They're primarily interested in defending rule by the rich. Part of the lie then is to consistently deny that you're lying. That's why this is gaslighting, right? This is the no, I'm not cheating. I can't believe you would accuse me of that. How dare you say I'm lying? I'm not lying. That's gaslighting. This is gaslighting. It's a consistent effort to win votes through racial appeals that depends on denying that that's what you're doing. So Trump, AOC, Ilhan Omar, they should go back where they came from. That's racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body. That's outrageous you said that, racist. I'm just about being patriotic and they hate America. They should go back where they came from. Shithole countries. I'm not racist. How dare you accuse me of being a racist? It's a theater, right? And the theater is we're going to promote racist thinking in society through the use of these evocative images of gangbangers and illegals and terrorists and welfare queens. And then we're going to deny that that's what we're doing. And then we're going to turn around and say, but see, they're the real racists, those people of color and they're those politically correct liberals who support them. See, we are racially divided. It's all part of the same theater.
But I think, as you point out in the book, this is not limited to the Republican Party. This has been part of the American political landscape for the last 50 years. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Clintons? Because I think, I certainly remember, well, not a pile on. We need to move on to your book. And I will say, I certainly remember the exhilaration of when Bill Clinton was elected, because I think there was certainly a sense that this was somebody who found the key to bring together an electoral majority in the United States. Right now, I think there's been a lot of reassessment of the Clintons in terms of their contribution, particularly Bill Clinton, with respect to their contribution to the discussion about race in our society. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So let me set it up this way. This has been going on for 50 years. For 50 years, Democrats have struggled to figure out how to break the power of dog whistling as a way to win over support from whites. And let's be clear, the Republican Party, they built that white man's party. 98% of their elected officials are white, and in presidential elections, they draw 90% of their support from whites, and that's from non-Hispanic whites. They're also saying 6% of their support comes from Latinos. I guarantee you the majority of them are light-skinned, but they built that white man's party. Is there a solution? Merge left. The argument is there is a solution. We pulled together racial justice folks, union folks. We did a lot of focus groups. We did a lot of polling. We did a lot of surveys. There's a really good way to beat this. I will get there so don't despair. We'll get there. But part of understanding why the solution works is understanding why prior solutions didn't. So here's what the Democrats understood almost immediately. So in 1970, so Richard Nixon is dog whistling all the time now, silent majority, law and order, crime in the streets, forced busing, right? Richard Nixon going crazy with dog whistles. Democrats immediately understand what's happening. Race is being weaponized. Racist thinking is being weaponized against them. And they also understand this whole racist theater, that if they accuse Nixon of racism, that people will respond by saying, I don't hear it. He just said silent majority, law and order, crime in the streets. I want to be safe. And then they would next say, but if you're accusing Nixon of being racist when he says that, you must be accusing me of being a racist when I want to be safe from crime. And Democrats knew immediately that trying to call Nixon a racist was actually going to cost them more than it was going to win them. So they decided in 1970, as a party, we're going to back away from African Americans. We're going to back away from civil rights. We've been too closely associated with civil rights. We're going to lose the white working class if we're seen as connected with African Americans. We're going to back away. As soon as they back away from African Americans and civil rights, they inevitably back away from labor. Labor, these are separate issues, but they're closely related. The labor movement was connected with civil rights. Many of the most active members of labor are coming from communities of color. They back away from civil rights. They back away from labor. So now you enter this period from 70, there's a little blip when Carter is elected, but through the 1980s, when the Democrats are staying silent about dog whistling. This is the strategy that Michael Dukakis pursues when he's running against Ronald Reagan's vice president, George Bush. And George Bush is initially down in the polls. Dukakis is doing fine because they're having a debate about who's going to run the economy. Reagan has enacted a series of tax cuts that have rewarded the rich, huge tax cuts for the billionaires. Middle class is suffering. There's been fraud in the financial market, this time in terms of savings and loan. The savings and loan market has collapsed. So you've got money going to the rich in terms of tax cuts. You've got financial fraud. You've got an economic crisis. Could be 2007, but it's actually no. This was back in the 80s. Dukakis is ahead, and then all of a sudden George Bush starts running an ad, the infamous Willie Horton ad, and the ad shows a black man, and the narrator says Willie Horton, released on furlough, kidnaps a white couple, rapes the woman. Dukakis was the governor. This is Dukakis on crime. And it's a very powerful visual message. The ad is pure dog whistling, uses Horton's face, changes his name from William to Willie to further racialize him, but never says black and never says white. Dukakis, in this Democratic tradition of, hey, I just got to ignore this. I can't call this out. In the month that ad ran, the voting public switched by 12 points. And now all of a sudden Dukakis was down and he went on to lose the election. Now, political scientists love to debate whether any one single ad can switch a campaign. And some say yes and some say no. We don't know. But the people who say yes, they point to Willie Horton. This ad was devastating. It might not have been the single factor. It might have been the single factor. It might not have been. But it was so devastating that Democrats turn around and say, we can't do that. We can't challenge it directly. We can't stay silent. So you know the adage, if you can't beat them, join them? Bill Clinton, 1992. Bill Clinton says, I'm a new kind of Democrat. We're the new Democrat. When they start calling themselves Blue Dog Democrats, what are their campaign themes? We are going to end welfare as a way of life, and we're going to crack down on crime because we're a new kind of Democrat. Well, okay, whose way of life is it? And who are the criminals you're about to crack down on? Right? So Bill Clinton essentially, and everybody now, I mean, you can listen to this. You can hear this now. People say, well, we need Clinton-esque policies because he won back the white working class. Oh, he did, but not on class issues. He won them back on racial issues in terms of racial resentment. So now you've got a Democratic administration that has promised to end welfare as a way of life and to crack down on crime. That's what it does. The biggest shredding of the sort of New Deal, Great Society's social net that occurs under Bill Clinton with the support of a Republican Congress. And the biggest expansion of the war on crime, Reagan had started it. Bill Clinton takes it even further with support from a Republican Congress. We end up over the 80s and the 90s in a period in which the Republicans and the Democrats are competing with each other to establish which party is going to be harsher in cracking down on criminals and on cutting welfare. Or, translated out of dog whistle terms, which party will be more violent, will inflict more state violence against communities of color. If you want to understand how we got to mass incarceration, We got to mass incarceration starting in 1970, running up through the Clinton administration and all of those years. We got there because Republicans and Democrats competed with each other to show who could inflict more violence on Black and brown communities. That's how we got there.
You want to briefly talk about the Sister Soldier exchange? Sometimes I forget how young many of our students are, and they may not know this historically, but I think that was a pivotal part of the election.
So Sister Soldier was one episode among many. Bill Clinton wanted to slap down the African American community in a public way in order to communicate to whites that he was not a Democrat that was sympathetic to the concerns of the African American community. One way to do that was to criticize the young rapper Sister Soldier. Another way to do that, there was a mentally incapacitated man who'd been convicted of murder and he was scheduled for execution in Arkansas, where Clinton was governor. He so little understood, I think Rector was his name, he so little understood what was happening to him that when they asked him what he wanted, whether he wanted dessert with his last meal, he said he wanted to save it for the next day. He had no conception of what he'd done and what he was being executed for. And Clinton made a point of traveling across country to be in Arkansas, to be present when he was executed. That is, Clinton was willing to countenance the execution of a human life to demonstrate he was a new sort of Democrat. To be clear, Clinton was also beloved by the Black community. So Clinton waged this kind of dual strategy where, on the one hand, he was busy communicating to whites, I'm keeping my distance. On the other hand, through a few strategic cultural performances, for example, he went on a Black show, the Arsenio Hall show, and played a saxophone, right? He's like, right. So the African American community is coming off of the Reagan years, the W. Bush, Willie Horton years. And so this is one of these, like, I don't know, maybe it's the Malcolm X thing, you know? I mean, the metaphor is like someone's stabbed you in the back with a knife and now someone pulls it halfway out and you're kind of like, well, thanks for pulling it halfway out. There's this element where Clinton looked good compared to Reagan and Bush. But when you step back and say, what was his larger politics? His larger politics was establish a basic rapport with a community that had been viciously demonized by the Republicans, and yet make clear to whites that he understood that the Black community was threatening and undeserving. And that was the sort of, you know, New Democrats always talk about triangulation. That was the triangulation. How do you at once communicate to whites that you're on their side and yet build rapport with Black and brown communities?
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that because Toni Morrison famously called Bill Clinton our first Black president. And then I think you see some of these discussions today with respect to Joe Biden, who always considered himself a new Democrat and has, I think, a history to demonstrate that, yet also has a very large support in the African American community. So, you know, I think that sort of illustrates a lot of the complexities of language and maybe the versatility of some of these politicians in terms of being able to speak to multiple audiences at one time. And I think that's a nice segue to your book. Do you want to talk about Merge Left and the empirical research you've done?
Not yet. I don't see tears. People aren't depressed enough yet. I always want to depress them just a little bit more before we do the solution. It actually connects with this comment.
Federal corn appointees? No.
Yeah. It connects with this comment. What's happening in communities of color? In communities of color, remember, the basic story being told by the right is Black and brown people are violent and lazy. But they're using the language of criminals and welfare queens rather than African Americans and Latinos, and certainly rather than racial epithets. When there is a strong element of conservatism within communities of color, there is a strong element that condemns lazy people and that condemns criminality. Let me be clear. One can be concerned that people take personal responsibility and that people work. One can be concerned that people not engage in law breaking. Yes, great. Thumbs up. What becomes dangerous is when stories of personal character become the predominant way in which we explain whether people are doing well in the marketplace and whether and why they're committing crime. right? If that becomes the predominant story, then that becomes a victim blaming story that is politically demobilizing and that excuses scarcity in our lives. That was a rush. If we talk about society in a way that explains criminality and poverty primarily as defects of culture, then the next step is to say, and therefore government can't help people because the problem is with their culture, not with structures. And therefore government cannot rehabilitate people through incarceration, but instead must simply remove them. And we should expect there to be poverty and crime. These are traits of character. Therefore, we should expect scarcity. We should expect homelessness. We should expect that people will not have access to healthcare. We can't give them those things. Those are their fault, right? A story that reframes the way in which oppression and marginalization and lack of resources are experienced as instead the fault of the individuals experiencing it, that's an incredibly destructive story. That story is common in communities of color. The story that blames people's faults for things like criminality or poverty is common in communities of color. So part of the reason it's common, frankly, is it's being pushed consistently by the right. The part of the reason it's common is because many black and brown politicians themselves push this story, and so do many black and brown churches. This is a very powerful, very destructive message. So how do we know that this message is resonating? One of the things that we wanted to know when we set out to figure out how to beat dog whistling is just how powerful dog whistle messages are and for whom do they resonate. So we did a national poll. One of the things we tested was whether people were convinced by a message that said, let me read you the message and see what you think. Who would find this convincing? Our leaders must prioritize keeping us safe and ensuring that hardworking Americans have the freedom to prosper. Taking a second look at people coming from terrorist countries who wish us harm, or at people from places overrun with drugs and criminal gangs, is just common sense. And so is curbing illegal immigration, so our communities are no longer flooded with people who refuse to follow our laws. We need to make sure we take care of our own people first, especially the people who politicians have cast aside for too long to cater to whatever special interest groups line their pockets, yell the loudest, or riot in the street. Now, most of the people I deal with on a daily basis call bullshit on that kind of messaging. In fact, they say, that's racist. You know, you're talking about people from terrorist countries who wish us harm. You mean Muslim countries. You mean majority Muslim countries. And actually, you mean Middle Eastern Muslim, right? And it's just, and what do you mean people who cross our borders are somehow criminal, right? Okay. Convincing to a majority of Republicans. No shock. Democrats? Yep. Convincing to a majority of Democrats. So we segmented the American voting population because Democrat and Republican are actually very big categories, a lot of range, a lot of noise within them. We segmented the American population into a progressive base, a persuadable group, and a conservative base. About 1/5 are in the progressive base. About 1/5 are in the conservative base. So 60% are in that persuadable group that goes back and forth. We can talk more about what these categories mean, but convincing to a majority of people in the persuadable group? Yep, definitely. But not the base, right? That 20% who are truly progressive, they get it? Nope. Majority of the base, majority, that 1/5 who are most committed progressives found that message convincing. Majority of African Americans, majority of Latinx. Majority of people of color were found, rated that message convincing. That is, when you tell a politically reactionary story that says the main danger our society faces is from dangerous and undeserving people, and that we need to take care of our own people first. As long as you don't use a racial epithet, you just carried the majority of Democrats, the majority of the progressive base, the majority of the Latinx population, and the majority of African Americans. That's how powerful this message is. Steal no tears, man, you are hardened. Because usually by now in a talk, people are like, I can't take it anymore. Who invited this creep?
Our students are fighters, so Good. They believe in action. They want a plan of action. Come on.
All right. We found a message that worked. We found a message that worked. It worked better with people of color. It worked better with whites. It worked better with the base. It worked better with persuadables. The opposition truly hates our message. Here's the message. Racism is being wielded as a weapon of the rich against all of us. The rich are taking our Social Security, our medical care, our education. They're pillaging our environment. Then they're turning around and encouraging us to point the finger at Black communities, at immigrants, at people with brown skin. When we reject division and come together, we can make this the country we all deserve, white, Black, and brown. There's a lot going on there. So let me break it down in terms of the first crucial move. And this may be the most challenging for people in this room. We are deeply steeped in an understanding of racism as fundamentally a conflict between whites and non-whites. And I say we because for almost all the years I taught race and American law and critical race theory, I came from this perspective. And studying race and law, you say the legislatures and judges who are running the country, who are passing the laws, who are enforcing the laws, who are inflicting massive state violence against community of color, they're white. Racism is a problem of whites against people of color. That frame makes sense. But think about how that frame works in terms of political messaging. It says to whites, you're the problem. And if we got to name that, we'll name it, but you're the problem. And a lot of whites react very defensively to it. We found that message is very popular with the base, the activist base. That message fails with communities of color who are not in the base. And just to be clear, that persuadable 60%, that's where the majority of African Americans and the majority of the Latinx people are. They are not base. Majority of African Americans and majority of Latinx are in this persuadable group. They hated a message that said the problem is white racism. Why? Because it felt overwhelming. If the problem is a racist in the White House and millions of racists who love him, backed by 400 years of racism, people said, pardon my French, but fuck it. This isn't going to change. I'm not solving this. I got to go do something else. I can only take care of myself. If you shift the frame and say racism is being used against all of us, it is a weapon that supports rule by the rich. And when racism is allowed to divide us, we all lose. This creates a very different move. It creates a way for whites to enter cross-racial solidarity as allies, where they can say to themselves, I am an equal and important ally in a cross-racial movement, and the well-being of my family, and if you want to put white in parentheses, do it. The well-being of my white family depends on me fighting racism against Black and brown people. That is how you can bring whites into a cross-racial movement.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.